All right, so welcome to the second video in Module 5, where we are talking about energy and active transport. So with this video, I think it's good to start off with just some basic concepts of energy before we talk about how energy is used to transport molecules across the cell membrane. So first, we have energy. Energy is basically defined as the capacity to cause change, to do work. Um, and one example of energy, and this is the example we're going to look at today, is where energy is used to perform work such as moving an object against an opposing force. And the opposing force in our case is going to be moving an object against its concentration gradient. So we talked about passive diffusion, where a molecule is moving an object with its concentration gradient, so from high concentration to low concentration. Active transport is going to be moving that molecule against its concentration, so from low to high concentration. First, we're going to basically talk about energy, and then we'll talk about where that energy comes from to move those molecules in active transportation. So there are two types of energy. You have kinetic energy, which is just the energy of motion. So if you're walking, running, swimming, that is a form of kinetic energy. Then you have potential energy. Potential energy is the stored energy that an object has, primarily based on its location or based on the structure of, say, a molecule. So potential energy can come in the form of, can have a couple of different forms. And life depends on the conversion of potential energy to kinetic energy and kinetic energy to potential energy. And so energy is basically conserved in that we don't make or destroy energy, but energy is also not this cyclical process. It can't be recycled because we do lose energy whenever we convert it into different forms. So for example, doing work, whenever you are walking, your cells are undergoing metabolism, which we'll talk about. And that process does not use 100% of the energy. We lose some of that energy as heat. And so that conversion causes a loss of energy. And so with that, thinking about those different forms of energy, can an object at rest have energy? So pause the video and think about this for a second. All right, so thinking about this question, just look at the definitions on this page. So kinetic energy and potential energy. So obviously, if an object is at rest, it's not at motion, so it's not kinetic energy. But an object at rest can have potential energy, because if it's at rest, it could have more or less energy based on its location. And here's an example. So let's say you're a diver and you're on a diving board. And so you have greatest potential energy because you're high above the water. And so that energy can be converted into kinetic energy when you move off the diving board and dive into the water. So you're converting that potential energy into kinetic energy. Now, when you're at rest, when you're in the water, your potential energy is less than when it is on the diving board, because you can't move down in your position. However, when you climb up the ladder and get back on the diving board, you're converting the potential energy in the water into kinetic energy, and then back into potential energy, because it's kinetic energy because you're moving up the ladder, and that energy you're used to move, you're converting back into potential energy when you get above that water and get ready to dive back in. And so this conversion process is known as the conservation of energy. So you're not destroying or creating energy. We're just converting it from one form into another. However, like I mentioned, we have heat that is a type of kinetic energy that is in the random motion of molecules. And then all conversion of energy, whether you're going from potential to kinetic or kinetic to potential, creates heat. And heat is known as, or I'm sorry, I should say, heat causes entropy to increase. So entropy is basically the disorder or randomness in a system. And so heat is a random motion of atoms and molecules. And so if you add heat to the system, you're increasing the entropy. And so every time energy is converted from one form to the other, you're adding heat. Therefore, the entropy is increasing within that system. And so molecules can have potential energy, just like the person standing on the diving board has potential energy. And we refer to this as chemical energy. And chemical energy comes from the arrangement of atoms and the bonds that are associated with those atoms. So living cells and automobile engines basically use a similar process to convert chemical energy into energy that will be turned into work. And so thinking about everything we've talked about, then look at this question here. Which form of energy is most randomized and is more difficult to put to work? So take a second to think about that. All right, so hopefully you realize that heat is the hardest form of energy to put into work and is the most randomized. So any heat that is released can't be taken advantage of in terms of being put to work. So heat is essentially lost energy. We lose that heat to our environment. And so we said that both machinery and cells use a similar process into conducting work and in generating energy to undergo either mechanical processes or cellular processes. And both of those come from chemical energy. So for example, you have octane, which comes from gasoline. It combines with oxygen, undergoes a combustion process, which releases energy that is heat, and is also kinetic energy of movement that is used to move that car. And what you get as a result is carbon dioxide and water. Cells undergo a similar process in which they take an organic molecule, chemical energy, and they combine it with oxygen. This is glucose in this example, undergoes cellular respiration, which extracts that energy to make ATP, and that ATP is then used for cellular work. There's heat released during this process, and then your products are carbon dioxide and water. So very similar process in which you're generating energy to undergo some sort of work process. And so cellular respiration is the process that cells use in order to break down that organic molecule and to generate energy. And we'll talk about the process of cellular respiration later on in the module in a separate video. What I want to talk about now, though, is how that chemical energy is changed from a glucose molecule and put into an ATP molecule. And so under that process of cellular respiration, which again we'll talk about in a couple videos in this module, is where the organic molecule is broken down and the energy from that organic molecule is stored in a molecule of ATP. So ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate, and it's basically this energy shuttle. It stores energy that comes from the glucose into this ATP molecule, and then we use that ATP molecule later on when that energy is needed. Now, ATP molecules are used relatively quickly compared to other energy molecules like glucose and fat. ATP is actually a shorter term storage compared to glycogen or triglycerol molecules, so those fat molecules. And so while ATP will store that energy, it's not a long-term storage. I should say that up front. And so here we have an ATP molecule, which is adenosine and 3-phosphate group, so adenosine triphosphate. Now, these phosphate groups are negatively charged, and they don't really want to be next to one another. There's a lot of energy going on here, and so they're trying to get away from one another, but these bonds are holding them together, so they don't want to be next to each other, basically. And so just imagine as if this is a spring kind of coiled up, and if we took some scissors and cut this bond and broke this bond, this phosphate would go flinging off, and the energy would be released. And so that's basically what happens whenever we use energy from an ATP molecule. You'll have a process where this bond will be broken between the second and third phosphate group. Energy will be released. That phosphate molecule will be transferred to another molecule, and you'll be left with adenosine diphosphate, so ADP. And so then that ADP molecule can later on, under cellular respiration, have a phosphate group attached back to it in order to make it or transport it into or make it another ATP molecule. And so that phosphate transfer is where that energy is stored and then released. And so ATP energizes other molecules by transferring that third phosphate molecule onto those molecules they're going to energize. And so there are a lot of processes that use ATP. So basically, when cells change shape, ATP is supporting that process. The transport of ions and active transport is one of those processes, and the production of other large molecules like dehydration synthesis is a process that uses ATP. So here we have some examples of that, where we have muscle cells contracting, we have active transport moving molecules across the plasma membrane, and then we have two reactants, two molecules being put together to make a product. So those are examples of processes where ATP is used to perform work. Okay, so now we know how energy is transferred to a molecule to allow that molecule to do work. We're now going to look at active transport, where active transport is moving molecules across the cell membrane, across the plasma membrane, against its concentration gradient, and it does so through the use of energy from ATP. So remember, passive transport doesn't need any energy because those cells are moving with their concentration gradient. However, with active transport, you need that energy because the molecules are being moved across the plasma membrane against their concentration gradient. So we have that cellular energy from ATP to drive protein pumps. So this ATP will put energy into a protein that will move a molecule against that concentration gradient. So from a low concentration to a high concentration. And so this active transport is actually really important because it allows cells to maintain a specific concentration of a molecule or a solute that's different from its environmental concentration. And so here in this figure, we have an example where you have high concentration of a molecule inside of a cell, low concentration outside of the cell. And the cell wants these molecules to move inside. So passively, these molecules will move from the inside of the cell to the outside of the cell. However, because the cell wants these molecules inside, we can use energy to bring that molecule in. So this solute will attach to this protein in its binding location, and then ATP will use energy from that third phosphate. That phosphate will attach to that protein, cause it to change shape. The energy will lead to that shape change, and then that molecule will be released to the inside of the cell. And again, that's moving that molecule from low to high molecule concentrations. Now, other ways that cells can move molecules in and out are through the processes of exocytosis and endocytosis. These are where the plasma membrane will basically pinch off and form a vacuole that's either pushing molecules out or bringing molecules in. For endocytosis, so endo, in, that's bringing molecules inward. Exocytosis, so exo, out, that's pushing molecules out of the cell itself. And again, it does this by the plasma membrane kind of invaginating around those molecules and either bringing them in or pushing them out. So here we have a figure of exocytosis. So here's a vacuole with molecules that are going to be exported out of the cell. That vacuole will bind with that plasma membrane and then release those molecules out. For endocytosis, those molecules will come in contact with the outer portion of the plasma membrane. The plasma membrane will invaginate around those molecules, then it will pinch off to form a vesicle, and then it will import those molecules inside of the cell. And so with this video, we've talked about how we get energy, or how energy is transferred through systems, what energy is, what it does, the importance of ATP in providing energy for cellular processes, and we looked at how ATP can be used in active transport to move molecules across the plasma membrane, which is against its concentration gradient. And so we're going to talk a lot more about these cellular processes and how cells generate energy. So through glycolysis, cellular respiration, and fermentation in the next videos that are in this module. So we will see you in those videos.